everybody, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. Today, it's our great privilege to host Dr. Jess Gifkins from the University of Manchester. Jess is a lecturer in international relations, and she's published widely and and to great acclaim on a number of areas in relation to mass atrocity prevention and the responsibility to protect. Today, Jess is going to talk about a recent report that she has co-written with protection approaches and some other scholars, including Dr. Dean Cooper-Cunningham, and they're going to be talking about the report titled "Queering R2P" or "Queering the Responsibility to Protect," which explores a neglected area of mass atrocity prevention, which is looking at the LGBTQI+ community as a potential target group and as a vulnerable community who historically have been subject to mass atrocities, and curiously enough, very little has been written about it, particularly in policy reports, but also amongst the literature in genocide studies. But Jess will cover all of this. The report, I will send up a link to the report during this presentation, because if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend that you do read it. I think it's brilliant, and I think it's one of the most important policy documents on atrocity prevention I've read for a long time. And I really like to congratulate the authors for the work that they've done in producing this report. Following the presentation by Jess, we're lucky to also enjoy the insights of other co-writers, other collaborators on the report. Dr. Dean Cooper-Cunningham from the University of Sheffield, Dr. Kate Ferguson and Farida Mustafa from Protection Approaches. They will also be available to answer questions and to participate in the Q&A session. So if you hear answers coming not just from Jess but from other people within the forum, that's just to give you some context there as well. But for now, I'll hand over to Jess.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. And yeah, thanks for that warm welcome, and yeah, for inviting me to speak here today. Yes, so thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here with you, and also to have my some of my collaborators with me to talk to you today. So I just wanted to start by saying a few things about the origins of the project and about the collaborative nature of this project, and kind of where we're up to and where we're going. So in terms of my own background, so by 2020, I'd worked on atrocity prevention for well over a decade. Most of my research is on the United Nations, on decision-making practices. And in that vein, I have a book under contract with Oxford University Press, and an ongoing collaboration with Stephen McLoughlin, where we are looking at the UN Secretariat and early warning. Yeah, so most of my research has been in the sort of UN and R2P sort of atrocity prevention sphere, but I hadn't given sufficient consideration to the relationship between queer people and atrocity prevention. So for me, it was my partner's gender transition, which took place alongside the rapid rise of transphobia in the UK and elsewhere, that prompted an urgency in considering what it might look like to queer atrocity prevention. And for me, this was also a welcome return to my undergraduate studies in gender and sexuality. So as part of this project, we're also building on work by Jamie Hagan, who published an article a few years ago titled "Queering the Women, Peace and Security Agenda." And that prompted a curiosity in thinking about what it might look like to queer atrocity prevention. And in terms of the collaborative nature of the project, I've been thinking about it as a Gestalt project, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I think it's been a really wonderful collaboration in us bringing together a variety of different perspectives and experiences. Yes, so Dean Cooper-Cunningham, who's on the call, Kate Ferguson, who's under the label of Protection Approaches there, Farida Mustafa, and Det Makrema, who couldn't be with us today. We've been very lucky to receive some funding from the FCDO to enable this research. And we have produced so far a report. It exists in the world in hard copy now. It's very exciting. If you're interested in a hard copy, you can contact Protection Approaches because we also have hard copies available. Yes, so we launched the report a couple of weeks ago, and we're also working on a journal article, which is the ongoing part of the project. So we began this project wanting to stress that LGBTQI+ people are always part of the community that atrocity prevention actors serve, and that is generally not explicit, and the specifics of that are generally not sort of taken seriously. If anyone is not familiar with the concept of the responsibility to protect, I was just going to give a brief outline of that concept here. So it began as a report from a commission in 2001, and where most reports from commissions probably don't make much impact in the world, the report titled The Responsibility to Protect did make a big impact, and it was taken up by the United Nations in 2005, where all UN members agreed that they have this responsibility to protect. And so the responsibility to protect, or R2P as it's known, is about protecting populations from 4 mass atrocity crimes. So that's genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And in the modern version of R2P, we also think about it having 3 pillars. So the idea is that the first pillar is the state's responsibility to provide that protection. The second pillar is about the international community working with states to provide protection. And then the third pillar is about the international community through the United Nations taking up that responsibility to protect if the state is manifestly failing to provide protection. So that's a brief outline for background. I guess, R2P has become quite a core feature of international relations, and you can see that looking at textbooks and looking at modules. Research on R2P was very focused on debates around humanitarian intervention and around rights and responsibilities of the international community. And over the last sort of decade and a half, it's become more nuanced and more intersectional, looking at areas around gender and post-colonial critiques. So it has really developed as an area, but it hasn't really engaged in intersectional analysis on queer vulnerabilities and persecution. There's been very limited research in that area. So we argue that LGBTQI+ persecution is a blind spot in research on R2P, and that this stems from heteronormative and cisgender underpinnings. And if you're not familiar with the word cisgender, cisgender means people who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. And you can think of that as an opposite to transgender, people who don't identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So we often make assumptions about heterosexuality and cisgender in research that we're doing in international relations. And what we're trying to do here is just to really critique that blind spot. So the connections between violence against LGBTQI+ people and R2P should have been intrinsic from the outset, really. Gay men, lesbian women, bisexuals and transgender people were specifically targeted as part of the Holocaust alongside Jews and Roma communities, disabled people and other groups. But after the Holocaust, the laws prohibiting homosexuality were still in place in Germany. So those who survived internment camps were then transferred to prisons. And the stigma around LGBTQI+ people continued. So even in genocide studies, which has a much longer history than research on R2P, genocide studies has only begun to really grapple with these connections in maybe the last 4 years or so. LGBTQI+ persecution remains widespread globally. 35% of UN member states have law or practice that criminalises consensual same-sex acts between adults. But we need to keep in mind that this is not a global South issue. We're seeing increasing repression and backlash against LGBTQI+ identities across Europe, including increased hate speech, increased violence, blaming LGBTQI+ people for COVID, and regression in rights for legal gender recognition. The unique vulnerabilities of LGBTQI+ people in situations of atrocity crimes needs to be taken seriously in literature and practice on R2P, and this includes the prevention of these crimes. So I wanted to just outline a few of the gaps in the literature as they stand at the moment, because these gaps are actually quite pervasive. So, for example, the premier academic journal on atrocity prevention, which is called Global Responsibility to Protect, had no articles focused on LGBTQI+ persecution across its first 13 volumes. Also, the largest compendium on atrocity prevention, which is the Oxford University Handbook on the Responsibility to Protect, it's over 1,000 pages long. It's a very substantive book, and it includes only one passing reference to queer identities. Now, we're not singling out specific actors or authors within the atrocity prevention community in this critique. We've all missed out on opportunities to draw these connections in the past, and I count myself in this. So I've published in that journal and I have a chapter in that book. But what we're asking here is that we're all more mindful of LGBTQI+ persecution in our work going forward. And I am in conversation with the editors of Global Responsibility to Protect about developing a special issue or a special section to really bring these debates to a broader audience on atrocity prevention. So there's certainly, we've found a lot of willingness to engage when we have provoked these conversations within the sector. Within the academic discipline of genocide studies, there has been rapid and growing interest in exploring the intersection of queer identities and atrocity crimes, and that's been really great to see and really encouraging. In terms of gaps in practice, we have found 15 publicly available frameworks of atrocity risk indicators, and none of these indicators, frameworks list LGBTQI+ communities or the vulnerabilities that they may face. So these indicators are used when creating early warning watch lists, when advising, states and NGOs on what types of situations they need to be really focused on. And we see that there's quite a serious gap there. We also see these silences in state practice. So every year in the General Assembly, there's an annual dialogue on the responsibility to protect. Dozens of states give a statement at that venue about their current thinking on R2P, their current the activities that they're engaging in domestically. And what we found looking at those statements is that they increasingly refer to identity groups, such as women and refugees, but there's little to no recognition of the risks faced by queer people. So we're really trying to provoke that, seeing those connections there. So in terms of queer persecution and atrocity crimes, we know that LGBTQI+ people have been targeted during and in the lead up to atrocity crimes, with the Holocaust as a key historical example of this. More recently, we've seen persecution and violence against queer people in Afghanistan, Hungary, Chechnya, Egypt, Ukraine, and Sudan, just to name a few examples. The history of modern atrocity crimes shows that persecution of LGBTQI+ people and queer communities commonly foreshadows the persecution of other groups. So the reassertion of patriarchal heteronormative values and legislation commonly come before wider acts of violence. From Nazi Germany to genocide in Darfur to the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, the imposition of moral codes that directly assault sexual and gender identities came before widespread state-led violence and atrocity crimes. So there's a clear relationship here that hasn't been unpacked sufficiently. More recently, we've seen LGBTQI+ people become targets for violence and extrajudicial executions in Afghanistan under the new Taliban rule. And likewise, moralistic anti-LGBTQI+ legislation and heteronormative internationalist projects have been a key feature of Putin's rule over the last decade. So the persecution of queerness in Russia, as enshrined in the 2013 gay propaganda law, is paired with internationally expansionist discourse, where Europe is constructed as gay Europa. So while we're not suggesting that all mass atrocities begin against a backdrop of violence and persecution of queer people, we do argue that such violence against LGBTQI+ people tends to be a precursor to escalation and faster democratic backsliding that queer people face, and that queer people face significant and unique insecurities during conflicts. So these vulnerabilities need to be accounted for in conflict and atrocity frameworks. So I'll say a few things here about the political logic of exclusion. So political homophobia and transphobia are not distinct from, but rather indicative of processes including democratic backsliding, a shift towards authoritarian politics, and the increased risk of identity-based violence. The Human Rights Council independent expert on the protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, Victor Madrigal-Borles, explains this relationship. And we were very lucky to have him speak at the launch of our report a couple of weeks ago. So Victor argues, and I'll quote here, that actors promoting regressive interpretations of LGBTQI+ rights make strong parallels between the nation and the family. Within this framing, the patriarchal and heteronormative family is depicted as the only one adding value to a country's national heritage. Gender ideology is conversely framed as an attack on national identities and traditions. Research in genocide studies shows that Nazis used similar framing, with homosexuality viewed as a threat to masculinity, to the family, and to the nation. In recent work, our co-author Dean has identified an important practice that has been developing in tandem with domestic state homophobia over the last decade in Russian foreign policy under Vladimir Putin. And Dean calls this heteronormative internationalism. So he argued that the heteronormative internationalism is when states or other actors use political homophobia as part of its foreign policy and/or as part of an internationalist political project. So Russia has consistently positioned itself as a space of traditional family values against morally decaying, sexually decadent Europe. In light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and intelligence reports of rumoured lists that include LGBTQI+ individuals, activists, organisations and allies, this heteronormative internationalism has new and important resonance. Likewise, in Hungary and Poland, we have seen the erosion of rights and protection of LGBTQI+ people. So Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán employs rhetoric of Christian or family values as being under threat from LGBT ideology emanating from the West. In Poland, over 1/3 of local governments have declared themselves LGBT-free zones, while heteronormative patriarchal pro-family politics have been used to further restrict reproductive rights, including a near-complete ban on abortion. So while Poland and Hungary are extreme, our other co-author, Detmer, has argued that the alarm bells are ringing across the continent and that we are ignoring them. The UK, for instance, it performs quite well if you look at rankings of legal rights for LGBTQI+ people. However, the focus on rights, and particularly securing the right to marry, are in some way red herrings against the continued violence against queer people. So hate crimes in England and Wales on the basis of homophobia or transphobia have increased year on year from 2016 to 2021, to the point where reported crimes have actually doubled over that period. And yet, studies repeatedly find that the vast majority of queer people who are subjected to hate crimes don't report these crimes to the police, meaning that the official figures miss the vast majority of LGBTQI+ hate crime. The UK is also home to a small but very vocal minority who actively oppose trans rights as part of a broader culture war. For example, in 2018, there were 230 articles in the Times newspaper sensationalising trans issues and creating a stigma around deviation from dominant sexual and gender norms. So that's like getting close to, almost one every day, which is wild when you think about it. that's such a key issue for the newspaper. So the practice of atrocity prevention teaches us that dehumanisation and fear-mongering rhetoric easily leaks from the page and the screen and contributes to the rise of persecution and identity-based violence. And we're seeing that here in the UK as well as elsewhere. But this is not a European challenge, it's a global challenge. So as another example, since the Taliban takeover, there has been a campaign to purge components of Afghan society deemed morally corrupt. And there have been reports of LGBTQI+ Afghans being victims of torture and extrajudicial executions. So by way of conclusion and synthesis, we started this project from the position of explicitly acknowledging that LGBTQI+ people are part of the who that R2P serves. And then we assume that the tools, approaches and policies should be fit for that purpose. Protection Approaches has long worked to push for more plural and devolved understandings of the responsibility to protect. And so a second assumption of our starting position is that R2P must also be felt to belong to LGBTQI+ people, communities and organisations. As co-author Kate, in another project with Fred Carver, have argued, the goal for those wishing to preserve, promote and strengthen the principle is therefore to open up how R2P and atrocity prevention is understood. That means taking it out of the UN and integrating it into state practice and civil society practice. So queering R2P and atrocity prevention therefore requires a triple interrogation of who, what and where. In too often conflating the experiences of cisgender and heterosexual women with gender, the atrocity prevention and women, peace and security fields of practice further entrench assumptions that presume this natural and predominantly Western system of cis heterosexuality. So what we're calling for here is for policymakers and scholars alike to think about the heteronormativity that is baked into atrocity prevention. There is a blindness to the anti-LGBT+ atrocities that have taken place, both historically and in current times, and how ignorance to the political homophobia and transphobia as a red flag has left us less well equipped to prevent or at least mitigate the severity of mass atrocity and war. So queering atrocity prevention is not only about seeing the violence affecting LGBTQI+ people, it's also about advancing a queer political conviction to question the dehumanisation of some and the protection of others along arbitrary lines. We are arguing for the recognition of anti-LGBTQI+ policies to be seen as warning signs of much larger, often authoritarian and far right-wing political agendas. We're also advocating for a queer politics to be rooted in a challenge to all systems of privilege. So I will leave it there and very much welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was so succinct and clear and really impactful, and I really appreciate that. I think, you know, both as a genocide scholar and somebody who's been really interested in atrocity prevention for a long time, having had conversations with you about this in the early stages of your work on this, my immediate reaction was, of course, why hasn't anybody looked at that? But I hadn't thought about it myself either. But as soon as you brought it up, it was absolutely obvious. And you only have to go back to the Holocaust to see how tragically relevant exploring this blind spot is, exploring this lacuna. And so I guess, you know, there are two broad observations that I guess, just to sum things up and just to crystallize it in my own mind. And these two things are both surprising in that it hasn't been explored in any great depth before, and just how necessary it is to understand effective atrocity prevention. And that is, well, first of all, to state the obvious, LGBTQI+ communities are part of the who that R2P serves. and that the tools, approaches, and policies should reflect that. And on top of that, political homophobia, as you mentioned, serves a larger goal, and that is quite often it's a warning of increased risk of identity-based violence that extends to other marginalized groups. So in a way, it's the canary in the coal mine. And that really drives home just how crucial understanding atrocity prevention of the LGBTQI plus community in relation to the LGBTI plus community is. One thing I reflected on in the report and what you talked about was how early on in Germany, in fact, prior to Hitler, during the Weimar community, that there was a stalling of the rights of the queer community in Germany. And this is the country which at the time was perhaps the most progressive place in the world for the queer community, although in 1929 that was, the bar was pretty low. But it's really interesting that the legislation aimed at legalizing homosexuality was put on hold after the 1929 market crash. Given that happened so readily in a country like Weimar Germany, I think gives pause for thought. I think, and it's also a warning against complacency and a reminder that even the most progressive countries in the world can backslide and can roll back on rights very quickly and very easily. That's a sobering reminder, I think. Also, it's a reminder that weaponizing issues around sexual identity, as is happening today, particularly weaponizing trans issues as part of the culture wars, for example, in the UK, is something quite dangerous. And as you've mentioned, it's already led to increases, dramatic increases in hate crime. And when circumstances change very quickly, those who are being scapegoated then become subject to quite rapid escalation of targeting and persecution. I've got a lot of questions that I would like to ask you, Jess, and the other collaborators on this report. I might reserve some for later, but right now I'm really interested in, I guess, the impact that this report has had so far. I know that you've taken it out on the road, as it were. I think you've had a lot of meetings and consultations, both virtually and in person, in the United Kingdom and in the United States, perhaps elsewhere as well. With governments, with other civil society organizations. And so I'm really curious, maybe you could share with us what kind of impact the report has had so far, and what kind of response it's had from these various groups, and what indication there might be on how it might influence policy framings around prevention, around early warning, and the like. And also, what are your plans from here? Where to from here?
Thank you, Stephen. That's very nice comments and good questions as well. I guess just on the gap, I think it's important to stress that it's especially R2P where this gap is in what we've looked at. Genocide studies is ahead of the R2P literature in this area, and Patrick Vernon, who's with us today, is somebody who has already been looking at these intersections. But when we look at gaps on sort of the heteronormative assumptions and cisgender assumptions, we see they also go beyond R2P. There was a report that came out on the United Nations last year that was showing in incredible depth the very limited engagement that the UN as a whole has had with LGBTQI plus people, especially beyond the World Health Organization and the HIV/AIDS crisis. So it's kind of there is a particular challenge of silence within R2P, but it's also within international relations as a discipline and UN practice beyond academia. And I mean, you flagged the sort of current backsliding on rights. I mean, just recently debates in the UK have been focused on conversion therapy. And when we launched the report a few weeks ago, we were flagging the UK's Safe to Be Me conference, which was scheduled for June. And since we launched the report, that has actually been cancelled by the UK government because so many LGBT actors from the sector have withdrawn because the UK government is trying to create a ban for homosexual conversion therapy practices, but they've tried to isolate out trans conversion therapies and allow those to continue, which was not acceptable for the sector. That was good that the sector has really stood up against that attempt to sort of separate the community. In terms of impact so far, I think Kate and potentially Farida are most well placed to take up that question, because they've been leading the external engagement there. And in terms of where we're going next, there's a paper that is coming out of Protection Approaches. Dean might like to say more about that, on Europe and atrocity prevention. And we're working on a journal article, potentially a special issue for Global R2P. Yeah, so there's certainly a range of academic outputs to come. But yeah, Kate or Farida, would you like to come in on the discussions you've been having with external organisations?
Yes, just thanks again for inviting Jess and us to kind of talk about this work with you all. I am right now, or not right now, but before this call started, working on a statement that Farida has been drafting that will come from the atrocity prevention community of practice. So researchers, organisations, and I don't know if we're going to get any donors, but we might try, because we've been bowled over by the warmth and generosity and welcome that this paper and this research and this project has elicited. Things feel really kind of grim in lots of levels at the moment right now in the world, particularly domestically on LGBTQ plus rights, but also globally in the field of atrocity prevention. And I feel so lucky that we work in a community of practice that is so open to looking at blind spots. And essentially we've, collectively produced this piece of work that says we can do better. I don't take that for granted at all. And I know that conversations that have tried to do a similar thing in different fields haven't faced that kind of warmth of reception. So that's really, really exciting. I mean, and truly every single person that Protection Approaches has spoken to, every meeting that I have held, whether that is a policy level with states, whether that is with funders, whether that is with atrocity prevention organisations, or whether that's with researchers, has been so positive. So that's really, really exciting. And so I'm hoping that we can build on that momentum by sort of getting some of that warmth down on paper, get some other people to kind of put some their name and organisation to statements, and then we'll be exploring how we can take forward in a kind of meaningful way how that happens and what that looks like for Protection Approaches in our fabulous research team. I think we'll see, and the extent to which Protection Approaches should continue to lead this work is very much a question, and that might not be appropriate in a year or so, but it's really exciting actually. And for those on this call, just an open invitation to explore what this research and these questions have raised for you. If you would like to be involved in collaborative work going forward, or thinking about how commitments you would yourself like to be, making can be taken forward, please let us know. And we can also definitely circulate that statement of intent to kind of queer our work more consciously and look at our gaps. And that'd be fabulous to have you with us.
As Jess sort of mentioned, so I'm Dean, by the way, I was part of the project. So as Jess kind of mentioned, we are sort of moving forward the academic work. I don't know if this is the time and place to announce, but we've also just been invited to contribute to another special issue on this, Jess. So there is a lot of academic interest in what's going on, particularly with links to women, peace and security. And so, no, and I guess I don't want to speak on behalf of the entire team, but I think we see the queering responsibility to protect, or queering atrocity prevention, and the women, peace and security work moving sort of in tandem with one another. So not necessarily separate, but completely intertwined, actually. One of the things that we've been super conscious of when we were doing this is that it might seem like it's become a little bit, we don't want Europe to come out as the queer utopia in this. So, and Jess also mentioned the inspiration for the project as being super close to home and starting from a personal experience and what's happening in the UK. So at the moment, Detmer and I are working on a piece it will be much shorter than the tome that you read for the Queering Atrocity Prevention report, but it takes that as the starting point and examines what's going on in Europe today. So the Queering AP piece that's linked here is that it actually takes a little bit more of a historical starting point. And the aim with the second piece is to bring that right up to date and actually focus a little bit more on what's happening in both Poland and Hungary, but also to think about not just acts of political homophobia, but acts of what I and some others call political homophilia, which is the inclusion of particular kinds of queer people and protections for particular kinds of queer people as both a nation branding tool and as the weaponization of queer friendliness to export civilizationalist projects, and that actually fans the flames of this, what we talk about in this report, the conflicting worldviews between Russia's heteronormative internationalist politics and this idea of Europe as a queer friendly space, which we seek to problematize, which is not just us, it's building on a lot of work in the queer and LGBT studies that is done in not just, but in international relations as a field.
Does anybody have any questions, anything they'd like to add to the discussion?
Thank you. Those are really good questions and thought-provoking questions. In terms of R2P, I guess protection approaches frames it around atrocity prevention more so than R2P, although obviously they're interconnected. The reason why I guess I particularly wanted to frame it around R2P is that this was a conversation within that community that I'm very much a part of that I didn't see happening. And I wanted my colleagues who work on R2P and do all kinds of excellent work to be, to understand what's happening in the UK and elsewhere and those kind of risks. So there was a strategic decision in terms of speaking to and with the R2P community and wanting that community to come on board, I guess. It is, I guess, somewhat unusual in R2P literature in that most R2P literature tends to focus on the third pillar, as you were highlighting there, and a lot of the debates end up being about Libya, about Syria, about Yemen, Myanmar, etc. And I guess, Stephen and I both did our PhDs in the Asia Pacific R2P Centre some years ago, and there were debates at the time about this idea of an R2P case, and that there was kind of a threshold above which something became an R2P case. And that was a position that Stephen and I and the centre didn't take, because R2P applies to all countries at all times, right? The Pillar 1 stuff is where I think a lot of the really interesting work is still to come. So I guess that's my take on that. I know there's a lot of problematic aspects to do with R2P, but I think, Pillar 1 and prevention has a lot more work to do. And I think there's particular conversations we want to provoke in that community. But all of that is up for debate, really. In terms of language, yeah, we that is something that we're mindful of. And we had discussions internally about what acronym to use, and went for LGBTQI+ as the kind of most inclusive. And because we do engage somewhat with intersex issues as well, and we wanted it to be the most inclusive version. But in the report, when we go through recommendations, we do flag that, you know, this language isn't language that resonates in lots of parts of the world, and it has Western baggage in lots of parts of the world as well. So yeah, I think there's certainly debates to be had there. I mean, the other option, I guess, is the UN version of SOGI, the sexual orientation and gender identity, but it doesn't really have resonance outside the UN, so we didn't go with that. Yeah, but really, really good questions. Thank you, Patrick. And I look forward to engaging with you further on this work and your excellent work. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
Patrick, you're right. We struggle with this. I mean, I spent 4 years trying to decide which language to use in my PhD, and it's a very big debate. The decision to land on LGBT, in the recommendations, so I think it's page 33 or 34, we do explicitly say that we would prefer not to use the L, the G, the B, the T, the Q, or the I moving forward, or to think about sexual identities and sexualities that are beyond those. So when we use that term, it's not explicitly sexualities or gender identities that fall into those labels, right? But then there's also the baggage of queer. Queer is not a term that existed in our vocabulary or language before the 1960s, 70s, 80s in US queer activism. So that also has a Western baggage, right? That there's a really, I'm not being condescending, so if you've read it, just do tell me. Translating Sexualities, it's an open access book published by EIR, the leading internet open access IR resource. And that's a phenomenal book that documents how queer also as a term doesn't exist in spaces like Russia or in many of the African countries. So it doesn't exist in Uganda, for instance. So the use of the term queer also carries that baggage. And I guess not to speak on behalf of everyone, but when you're writing for both a policy audience and an academic audience, I think we would gain a little, I think we would take on too many debates if we started with the word queer. So if we can dip the toe in the water and push towards that, then maybe that's useful for the first step.
Agree. I just wanted to say some stuff on R2P because, I mean, long before this paper, but also one of the reasons that I've been so excited to work on this is I've really been so interested, really since the beginning, at thinking about how we can open up what R2P means. And it might be that, I mean, I trained as a historian, and so far, most academic literature on R2P tends to come from political science and international relations. Whereas from history, we get a much longer look at the world. And so if you think about the history of rights, the responsibility to protect populations from atrocity crimes as a kind of international principle has existed for about 4 seconds, not 16 years. And then it's actually extraordinary what that contribution has done about raising expectations. And also that perspective, I think, allows us to think about R2P as something really, the roots of which are actually pretty ancient and universal. Now, how it has become used and how it has become instrumentalized and sort of the utility of it during the war on terror and how Libya went wrong, you know, it is so beyond appalling and frustrating that it's not to negate any of that. But the work that I do and a lot of the work that Protection Approaches does is sort of looking at how we can open up R2P in terms of who it is for, so who that protection is afforded to. And the paradigm of genocide, unfortunately, continues to kind of ring heavy in R2P, which is, I think, one of the reasons that queer populations have been traditionally excluded. But it's also who the responsibilities are for. And again, sort of taking that quote that Jess gave, taking it out of the rooms of the United Nations, flowing through states and the composite parts of their societies. When that responsibility kicks in, I'm not one of the narrow but deep approaches of R2P. painful as it is to disagree with fantastic Jennifer Welsh, but I do. I think that it is broader and more expansive than that. Again, pushing where R2P is for, and pushing at that conceptualization that even the first pillar isn't for states in the global north. And if states in the global north aren't going to take on the language of R2P, well, then we do have a problem. Then I think there's a question about whether we should still be using it, but I don't think we're quite there yet. And the last thing I'll say is I'm very new to queer theory. That's not my background. And one of the things that I have really found interesting and exciting about this work is that I actually now wonder whether thinking about what queering work and processes mean actually might even provide some of the answers I've been searching for years in how we open up and understand the pillars, processes, concepts, access to the principle itself. So that's my reflection on that very important, tricky question.
Do we have any other questions, contributions from anybody?
I don't mind jumping in just with 3 super quick ones. One is the overstretch of the atrocity prevention community, particularly those in practice and also in policy, is enormous. The world is on fire. Climate crisis is burning the house down. Ukraine is terrifying. It's distracted us from Afghanistan, which has distracted us from Syria, which has distracted us from Central African Republic. You know, the list goes on and on and on. And funding in the space is shrinking. Funding for prevention is shrinking. And so I think that all of that goodwill, welcome, commitment that I said in the beginning needs to be tempered by where the money is and the resource. And to do this work properly, even if it's thinking about our own teams and how we better support our queer staff and so on, that requires funding and resource and time to do it appropriately, or you raise expectations and you disappoint. So that's one. And I suppose resource is the other. And so that's sort of part of that. And then the other, we are based as an organization in London, and our government. That's a real challenge. Our government is going through mind-bending kind of contestations. And what we're getting on the outside is essentially an assault on rights and an assault on organizations. And it's making it hard for any organization to work with Stonewall or champion them, to be strong on these issues. And there are good people within the FCDO trying their very hardest to maintain and protect the funds that supported this project, for example. But I think that the direction of this government and who becomes leader next could genuinely be really quite a problem for taking this work forward. But that's why it's exciting that we got it out now and we got global support, and we're not afraid of a bit of a fight if need be. So not to end it on a downer, but on a bit of a, we're ready for action. But I don't know what others will think.
I think I, not having spent as much time as Kate and Farida and the folks at Protection Approaches thinking about this, I am based in Denmark currently, at least for the next few days. And one of the benefits of Danish academia is a really incredibly close connection to the government, actually. They are currently bidding for the Security Council presidency, or will be bidding for the Security Council presidency, which is exactly what Kate said. Everyone is stretched thin. So even just trying to reach out to people who you usually can have a very close and easy connection with, it's just incredibly difficult to shift it up the agenda. But it is stuff that we're trying to do.
No, I think that's a really good question to end things on, because it's it reveals the challenges, but it also I think it brings out, I guess, the determination and the commitment to ride through them, which is inspiring. I'm really curious to see what happens next with this work, because a lot has happened in a short time, and it's been one of those aha moments for me reading this report and talking to Jess about it. So every now and then you get one of those aha moments in research, and this was one of them for me. So thank you so much. It's been wonderful to host this, and thanks, Jess, so much for speaking. Thanks, Kate, Farida, and Dean for contributing as well. Really appreciate it.